Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the Wild Neighbors speaker series. I think we can go ahead and get started. My name is Johanna Arendt, and I am community liaison with Travis County Natural Resources. And this webinar series is a collaboration between Travis County and the City of Austin Wildland Conservation Division, which co-manages the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve with Travis County and a number of other private and public partners. Today, we're really happy to welcome Dr. Ed LeBrun, who is a research scientist with the Department of Integrative Biology at the Brackenridge Field Laboratory at UT Austin, and he works there with an invasive species laboratory. And we're really happy to have him speaking today on this really important topic of Tawny Crazy Ants, which are becoming a much bigger problem as time passes. So if you have questions, we'll have a live Q&A session at the end, which will be moderated by Kate McCann with the City of Austin. So go ahead and put any questions that you have in the Q&A section, which is different from the chat. So just take a look at those labels and put in the Q&A section, and she'll be reading those questions to Dr. LeBrun at the end of his presentation. So without further ado, or actually just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded, so just let you all know that. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. LeBrun, and I'll stop sharing my screen so you can bring your presentation up.
Hello, everyone. So hopefully everybody can see me and hear me. My name is Ed LeBrun. I'm going to share my screen now. And as Joanna said, I'm a research scientist at the Brackenridge Field Lab here in Austin. I've been working since about 2009, off and on Tawny Crazy Ants. And so today I'm going to be telling you guys about a variety of topics in sort of basic biology of Tawny Crazy Ants, things we've learned in studying them since we began work on this in 2009. But obviously I'm speaking to you because there are crazy ants that are impacting the Balcones Canyonlands preserve system. And so at the end, I will circle back to sort of more local stuff and talk about sort of where they are in Travis County and how to stop spreading them. And we can talk in question and answers about what folks can do to limit their spread. But most of the talk will be more basic biology. I'd like to thank my collaborators in this, which are Larry Gilbert, Rob Plows, Pat Fulbright, Martine Bolassi, and Melissa Jones, and then that have worked specifically in this research. Tawny Crazy Ants are an invasive species. They originate in central South America. So these orange pins here are collection localities that are from the native range of Tawny Crazy Ants. They have been introduced elsewhere in the world. In fact, in the 70s, they were intentionally introduced, which was a very bad idea, into Colombia, and they caused quite a few problems there. And they've since spread to other parts of the world and the Southeast United States. This region of South America is particularly fascinating because actually all of our major globally invasive ant species that impact us here in the southeastern United States are from this region of South America. It's a floodplain habitat of the Rio Paraná, Paraguay. It looks kind of like this. And this is where imported fire ants are from. It's where Argentine ants are from. It's where other kinds of imported fire ants are from. And a bunch of other ants that are less noxious, but here as well. So the first detection of Tawny Crazy Ants in the United States was in South Florida in 1990. And then in 2002, they showed up in Texas. And then you can see that rapidly after that, new populations in new counties sort of spread throughout the Southeast. And this is, 7 years out of date now. So quite a bit more of this process has gone on in the interim. and some sort of climate-based modeling that projecting suitable regions of the United States for these ants is shown here. In this modeling effort, it's using occurrence records in the native range and the environmental characteristics of those areas to project suitable habitat in North America. And it's a probabilistic assessment. So anything basically dark yellow or darker is likely to be good habitat for from a strictly climate perspective, really good habitat for Tawny Crazy Ants. And you see it's pretty much restricted to the southeastern United States, central Texas, and then it sort of pushes out up into here into the hill country, which is where we're most focused on right now. So these ants are omnivorous, which means they prey on whatever they can find, animal matter, vegetable matter, but particularly they feed on sugary solutions, so either extrafloral nectars on plants or nectaries on plants, or the exudates of sap-feeding insects, which are sugary, and then they also eat insects. They're ecologically dominant. They sort of successfully capture a very large fraction of the resource base. They have many hundreds of queens per nest, and they nest opportunistically, which means basically any existing cavity is what they want for a nest. They don't do a lot of digging. They don't make mounds. The reproduction is different from most ants in that there are no alate flights. Males do fly. That text is wrong. But all mating appears to be within the nest, and establishment of new colonies is strictly through nest fission. So a big nest divides into two and splits. The result of that is that populations spread radially. So they start at a center point, and as nests fuse, they become larger and larger circles on the landscape. And that rate of spread can vary from nothing if it's a bad year to up to like 200 meters a year of radial spread. Another important characteristic is the truly extreme densities these populations reach in areas, and this is typically in the late summer, fall, when these invasions are peaking. And in these kinds of areas, you know, the ground just seethes with ants everywhere you look. All the trees have columns of ants running up and down. This video was filmed by Richard Saria. So what do they do to the environment? So they do have these extreme densities do have profound impacts on the environments that they invade. So this is some data from two sites near the Houston area, and showing the reduction in the number of species that occur in areas invaded by Tawny Crazy Ants. And what's interesting here is that the areas without Tawny Crazy Ants, the open circles, which have higher species richness, those are heavily invaded by imported fire ants. These are very dense imported fire ant populations. So the impacts that Tawny Crazy Ants are having is more extreme than the suppression of diversity that fire ants do. Now this is a bit sort of ant quirky stuff, but it's non-random, the species that are lost. The large-bodied species are lost. Any ant larger than Tawny Crazy Ants are the ones that are displaced, and ants smaller than Tawny Crazy Ants typically are not impacted. This has another unusual effect, at least around the Houston area, in that most of the ants in that area, the smaller ants, are from somewhere else in the world. Invasive ants generally tend to be smaller than, tend to be small-bodied ants. And so as a result, what's lost from the species pool are all of our native Texas ants, and what's retained are all of the tramp ants from other parts of the world. This is probably because Tawny Crazy Ants can't invade the nests of ants smaller than them. They also impact arthropods generally. So these plots are similarly comparing areas at in front of an invading, expanding Tawny Crazy Ant population to areas behind them. So these are areas going, the negative numbers here are going back behind the Tawny Crazy Ant front into areas that have been invaded for progressively more time. So these areas, and in front is in fire ant controlled habitat. And there's a widespread impact on arthropods. There's a loss of abundance in all arthropods, and it's significant for all different trophic levels of arthropods. And there's also a loss in species richness for all arthropods, but also particularly for herbivores. Herbivores seem to be the ones that are most strongly impacted. And aside from arthropods, there's impacts more broadly that haven't been well quantified. Things like lizards and snakes tend to disappear. Nestling birds tend to fail. The nests tend to fail because they get overwhelmed by ants, and the birds spend so much time sort of picking ants off that the nestlings often just fall out of the nest. There's some video of that. So these impacts are more broad spread than just insects and other arthropods. There are other environmental impacts, and one of the most prominent is the displacement of imported fire ants. So when a Tawny Crazy Ant population invades an area, imported fire ants are really rapidly eliminated. And in these plots, what you see is Tawny Crazy Ants on the top and fire ants on the bottom, and this same setup where this is distance behind the Tawny Crazy Ant invasion front. So that's areas that have been invaded for progressively more and more time, 600 meters, probably 3 years of time that the crazy ants have been present. And you see the increase in Tawny Crazy Ants as you move back, and you see the disappearance of imported fire ants. This shows the same effect, but just looking at one spot in time as an invasion front crosses over. And what you see is the absence of Tawny Crazy Ants at the beginning point in time, and then their arrival. This is a seasonal oscillation in abundance that becomes very important later on in the talk. It's very common that crazy ants have very high population abundance in the late summer and fall and very low in the spring. But other ants show the same because it's also partially activity. But then back to the main point, fire ants densities goes down and then it crashes to zero. So they eliminate fire ants. So how do they eliminate fire ants? This is a sort of profoundly impressive thing to do. Fire ants are really tough competitors. And one suggestion is just these extreme numbers, right? They just overwhelm the fire ants because of the numbers, and the numbers are everything. That's not true. So this data shows that that on a per capita basis, so on a numerically equivalent basis, Tawny Crazy Ants are superior competitors for food resources when paired, one-on-one with fire ants. So this is relative abundance of the ants. So 1-to-1 is when they have they're equally abundant with respect to each other. And when they're equally abundant, the probability that Tawny Crazy Ants will win an interaction over a food resource is 68%. When the probability that will win a resource is 50-50, then the relative abundance is 2-to-1 in favor of fire ants. So fire ants only win when they have quite a large numerical advantage. So why is this? How are they able to displace fire ants, which are, as I said, very impressive competitors? So I'm going to show you a video here that shows what these interactions look like in a macro scale. And so to orient you a little bit, to understand what's going on, this is an imported fire ant worker. This is a Tawny Crazy Ant worker. The imported fire ant has a stinger, right, that you can see right here. It's averted. And the way imported fire ants fight other ants is they exude a droplet of venom off of their stinger, and they smear it like a paintbrush on the other ant species. And their venom is an incredibly toxic topical insecticide. It's 100 times more toxic per unit weight than DDT. And Tawny Crazy Ants have a very different way of fighting. They don't have a stinger. They have what's called an acidopore, which is something like a spray nozzle on an aerosol can, and it's full of acid. So they fight by macing their opponent with acid, formic acid. So this is what this looks like. So here's a Tawny Crazy Ant. She's spraying acid at the fire ant, and then she goes up and she takes that droplet of venom right off the imported fire ant stinger. That should be death. I mean, that's insane behavior, suicide. Now, if you watch the ant, what she's going to do is she will come around in a moment and do another behavior where she'll tuck her abdomen under her body. And let's see, maybe be a little patient. This is the ant here, that behavior there. She tucks the abdomen under and she actually seems to be transferring some sort of fluid. And then she goes right back up to the fire ant, does that behavior again, goes up and takes that second droplet of venom there. Again, should be suicide. This is what this behavior looks like in isolation. I've applied the venom to the ant this time, and she's going to tuck her gaster, and you can see the transfer of fluid as she takes something from her acidopore and she starts spreading it all over her mouth parts and antenna. And this looks like, for all the world, that this ant is trying to detoxify fire ant venom. And so to see if that's what's going on, we did some experiments, and the short answer is yes. Tawny Crazy Ants can detoxify imported fire ant venom. To do this, we basically closed off the acidopores from Tawny Crazy Ants using nail polish, and we challenged them in arenas with fire ants. And then other ones we sham treated, so that the nail polish was applied to a different part of their body and they could still exude their venom. And the sham treated ants survive conflict with imported fire ants 100% of the time. And those with their acidopores sealed died 50% of the time. And they were only allowed to very briefly contact fire ant venom in these experiments. And we did some more work, and we demonstrated that the compound involved is the formic acid. And it makes sense because the insecticidal compounds in fire ant venoms are alkaloids, same kinds of compounds like caffeine or other secondary plant compounds, nicotine. And these alkaloids are basic in nature, and the acid seems to neutralize them. There's some data just showing the nature of the various venom compounds, and the data showing that that is what's going on. So that's how they displace fire ants, but how do they reach these crazy densities? So here's another video of what these kinds of environments can look like. This is just one tree. This is an ebony tree in Weslaco, Texas, at the Llano Grande State Park. And you can see that it's just seething with ants. And it's this way all the way around the trunk. And other trees in this environment are like this. Other, patches of ground are like what you saw before, where it's just ants everywhere. And so how does this come to be? Well, we don't have the full answer to that, but part of the answer lies in their social organization. So Tawny Crazy Ants are somewhat unique in that they are super colonial. What that means is that this is actually a trait shared by a lot of really hard-hitting invasive ants, but it's a trait that's very rare amongst other ants outside of that category. But what supercolonial means is that within a population, so within an area that's infested by ants, by crazy ants, every nest is interconnected, and they all are from the same colony. So they're all colony mates. And this interconnected nature means that they can share resources. So this plot shows an example of that, where we put out some highly dyed sugar water, dyed food coloring, and then tracked how far that dye spread from the bait station through the ants. So only the local ants are contacting it, but how far away can we find it in the ants in general? And we would find it out to about 40 meters, 45 meters away from that bait station. And so that dye is being transmitted by one ant feeding another ant, who then meets another ant, who feeds another ant, who meets another ant, who feeds another ant. And so resources that are captured at one point have the ability to spread throughout um, the population, or at least the local area of the population. They can also optimize their use of nest sites because of this biology, and there are other issues. So other benefits. There's another consequence of this, which is that because they're all members of the same colony, there's no aggression within these populations. So if you take, and this plot shows this. So these are aggression assays where we take some ants and we put them in a neutral arena with other crazy ants from different places, and you score aggression behaviors. And I'm not going to go into the details too much of those aggression assays, but here in the introduced range, which is North America, so these are nest mates. So these are ants we collected from the same nest and separated and brought back together. And you can see this is the level of aggression you see, which is a 1 is not an aggression, it's just ants interacting. These are ants taken from the same population close, about 50 meters apart, put them together, and no aggression. But more interestingly, these are ants taken from different parts of Texas. So these are populations that are separated by hundreds of kilometers, or at least 100 kilometers, and same result, no aggression. And then even if you take ants from Florida and Texas, which is what we did, same result, no aggression. So they're in the introduced range. Not only are these populations super colonies, but they're actually fragments of a much larger super colony that is distributed across the southeastern United States. Now, just briefly to point out, that is not true for ants generally. It's crazy ants generally. In the native range in South America, there's lots of aggression at short scales. So some of the benefits of this supercolonial social biology is that they have a distributed foraging network. They can sort of find resources everywhere. They have reduced interspecific competition. They have functional integration across space. They can sort of occupy all the available nest sites, and a consequence is higher population densities. But there is a hypothesized ecological cost. I say hypothesized because nobody's ever really demonstrated it. It's just been talked about a lot, which is that these types of social entities should be more vulnerable to pathogens. And you can imagine that if a disease is able to get into one of these nests, it can spread through that network of interactions through to the whole population potentially. Well, when was it? I guess in about 2014, we found a pathogen of Tawny Crazy Ants, and it's one that's already present here in the United States. We found it in populations in Florida and in Texas. It's the first documented pathogen of this ant, and since then there have been some viruses that have been found in South America. It's a microsporidium. Okay, so let me explain and when we don't know where it came from, let me explain what a microsporidium is. But it has distinct spore types. So this is one spore type, this type 2DK, there's another, this is an octospore, second spore type. But microsporidium pathogens, they're specialized single cells organisms that reproduce inside the cells of their hosts. So they're called intracellular pathogens, and they're related to fungi. They have a very virus-like biology. So the spore that they form, which is down here, has what's called this polar tube, which is this coiled spring-like tube, and this vacuole in the back end of the spore. And when they contact their host cell, they fire this spore out, and it has a harpoon tip, and it penetrates the host wall of the host cell, and they basically squeeze their entire cellular contents down this tube and into the host. And then they go about reproducing. So to understand a little more about this, we first started looking at sort of how it gets around in the colonies. So these are all the potential ways that a pathogen could move within a colony of crazy ants. So this is the queen, this is a worker with eggs, so workers tending brood, which is the larvae, and then these are the pupae. And then these are adult workers again. And what we found was that, surprisingly, there's really only one pathway for transmission, and that is when an infected worker takes care of an uninfected larva. That then develops into an infected pupae, which develops into an infected worker, and it cycles within the ant colony like that. Appears as if only larvae are susceptible to infection. So what does it do to the ants? We conducted a laboratory study in which we gave fragments sufficient sugar or insufficient sugar, and then they were either infected or uninfected fragments, and we followed their trajectories of growth or decline. And what we saw was that the microsporidium impacts crazy ant colonies by reducing larval developmental success and shortening worker lifespan quite a bit. And it does so much more strongly when the ants are stressed for sugar, when they don't quite have enough sugar, than when they have all the sugar they need. But how do these results translate to nature? What is this pathogen doing to Tawny Crazy Ant populations? I told you we found this in Florida and in Texas. It's not something that we brought up from South America. The answer is it does quite a bit. This plot on the left shows populations that we studied over a period of 12 years. And we were able to go back that far because even though we only discovered the microsporidium in 2014, was because we had samples in the freezer that we've been collecting information on abundance, and we could go back and test for infection. And following populations longitudinally through time, so going back every fall and sampling year after year after year, measuring abundance and checking disease burden, infection of the ants, what you see is that as disease burden of nests goes up, the local abundance of crazy ants goes down. And over time, in this plot, this is elapsed years. This is a little bit older plot, but this is elapsed years until the disease prevalence equals 100%. So at 0, these populations, every nest we test is infected. And these are all populations that were uninfected. And this is their abundance. And you can see that over time it declines quite dramatically. So this sounds like a fantastic potential as a biological control agent. And so we've begun work on that, and we're making good progress. And the first 2 sites we've attempted we've introduced into more, but first 2 sites we have data for are this Whirlpool Cave area, which is in the Convict Hill region, and Estero Grande State Park in West Lithia, where I showed that tree that was seething with ants. We inoculated the populations by introducing infected ants into them, and then followed the disease spread and what happened. And what happened was fairly dramatic. So the prevalence of Nylandaria, of Myrmeforma Nylandaria, which is this microsporidium, went up with spread. The incidence of disease burden went up with time, and the crazy ants actually both collapsed to local extinction within about 2 to 3 years after introduction. The ants are now gone from those sites. We're occasionally seeing some things pop up now at Whirlpool, very small incidences, and we're trying to understand that better. And we haven't seen them at Estero since. Why are these things declining to extinction? This is a weird thing. Pathogens don't normally drive their hosts extinct. We think the answer is this. So these are following nest fragments in the laboratory. And what you see is that uninfected ants nests for all seasons sort of have the same survivorship curve. This is the fraction of the original number of nests that are surviving after a certain amount of time. But infected nests, if they were collected in the non-growing season, so the fall, winter, decline very rapidly to extinction. And in the summer, they decline more rapidly, but not as much so. And what we see in nature is just that. So in wintertime is when populations come way down. And in winter, the queens stop producing eggs and larvae. So there's no new workers being added to the population, young workers. It's just old workers that have to make it through the winter. And so it appears that this shortening of lifespan is such that the older infected workers are unable to survive from the fall to the spring when new workers would replace them. And so that by spring in these infected populations, the queens are left with no workforce. Okay, so shifting gears to more local stuff. These are all the sites in that I know of that are infected with Tawny Crazy Ants as of right now. Red pins are ones that were infected and the ants have since disappeared. We think due to this, because of this pathogen, we know it's true, at least we've documented from 2 of these sites. This site we weren't following very carefully. Several of these sites are either in or near the BCP, Emma Long, Collins Tract, Pace Bend. And it's important to understand that these ants aren't just getting there on their own. They're getting there because people are bringing them to these sites. And that's the only way they get to them, because they don't have wing dispersal. So it's really important to be careful about what you do. So be careful about moving potted plants, check them for ants. Be careful if you go to the nursery and you buy a plant, check it for ants. Be careful in bulky pickup. Don't go around picking up things without checking them for ants. These are populations where we are sort of, by mapping the edges and going to the center, we can kind of guess as to how they got there. And you can see some of them are landscaping stores are right at the center. So your Lowe's, your garden stores. Some are household goods. So this one out by Pace Bend turned out to be the center of the population. Was a condominium, and we didn't really understand what was going on until we learned that almost all the residents in those vacation condos lived in Houston, which was at that time overrun with crazy ants. And this was one of the first populations in Travis County. It was the first population, in Travis County. And then others are storage facilities are at the center. So we think people bringing their stuff to store full of ants. And RVs are another really big source of infection. So RV parks, if you have an RV, you want to check it for ants before you go to some new, exciting natural location, because you may cause a lot of harm. And then this oddball one, cement plants, that's a recurrent phenomenon, and I don't have a good explanation for it, honestly. Perhaps the lime mining, maybe there's an area with, I know some areas with lime, so it could be it. So currently what we're working on is developing more efficient inoculation strategies for this disease and testing its efficacy. And we are, the idea is to use this as a tool for protecting habitat that is particularly sensitive or particularly valuable, or, possesses endangered species. Currently, it's very expensive and time-consuming thing to do. So it's probably not likely to get rolled out as kind of a generalized thing to do, but more of a responding to crisis kind of situations. But we'll see. Maybe we can get the costs down. Sorry. So thanks. These are all the folks that have worked on this project in the past, and I'd love to hear whatever questions people have.
Great, thanks so much. So just a reminder, everyone, you can put your questions in the Q&A, which probably appears at the bottom of your screen. We'll start there. So our first question is, when they fight fire ants, why do Tawny Crazy Ants remove the venom? Is it to disarm it before it smears it on the Tawny Crazy Ant?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that would be my guess. Honestly, I don't know. When I saw that video for the first time, I was really surprised by that. I'd seen the behavior, but I hadn't seen them actually just removing the droplet of venoms from the fire ant stingers. And I think that's it. I think that they can actually only get their acidophore to their mouth parts, and their head, and then they can use their front legs to distribute it a little more broadly. But if venom is applied to the side of their thorax, the side of their, the middle part of their body, or something, they can't get to it. So I think it's a way to sort of control the interaction.
Great. The next question is related. Do tawny crazy ants kill fire ants by macing them, or do they just drive the fire ants from their home to another location?
Yeah, they what they do is they actually so I mentioned that they don't dig mounds and that they use pre-existing cavities. Well, it turns out one of their favorite types of pre-existing cavities is fire ant mounds. So they actually raid the fire ant mounds, and they slowly over time evict the fire ants from the mound and then occupy that mound as their own nest. So eventually the fire ants just run out of places to be.
Thank you. And another kind of related question, why not let the tawny crazy ants outcompete the red imported fire ants before introducing fungi into those populations?
Well, we don't have quite that level of control. So the I showed you what we've done, right? But I haven't showed you all the times that we haven't really succeeded very well in getting the disease established. So it's not like we can just go in and say, "Ha, we introduced the disease. 2 years, we expect the ants to be gone." It's a lot more trial and error. This time it succeeded. This time we need to try again next year, and it's expensive. So there's that. Just the labor. It's very labor intensive. But the other is that even though these ants are quite effective at eliminating fire ants, and then the disease is, when we get it established, and there's about 3 more years for things to percolate, very effective at eliminating the ants, fire ants come back very rapidly. So it's not like fire ants are gone long term. Once the tawny crazy ants are gone, fire ants are back. And it's because that's actually fire ants' their niche. That's what they do. They colonize disturbed environments where there are openings in the ant community.
Thanks. And a neighbor near Emelong Park, one of the areas that we've is close to the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve, asked, should we change our strategy on controlling fire ants if we live near Emelong, or just continue as we normally do?
I don't know. That's kind of a personal choice. It certainly depends on, fire ants do provide some measure of resistance to tawny crazy ants. They don't, when the tawny crazy ants are very abundant, they aren't very successful at displacing them. They aren't very successful at keeping tawny crazy ants out. But if you happen to be allergic to fire ant stings, I'm certainly not going to tell you not to, control your fire ants. I think it's a personal choice.
Great. So we've got a couple questions about microsporidium, and then we're going to kind of switch and talk about what we can do to prevent the spread of tawny crazy ants. So the first microsporidium question is, how does it affect, or does it affect other species, specifically native species?
Yeah, so that's a very important question. So normally we would not do this sort of thing without a huge amount of testing, because we would normally, when you're talking about introducing a natural enemy, you're bringing it from South America or wherever the invasive species is from. And in this case, it's already here, and it pops up regularly. We see it on its own colonizing populations, and we don't know why or how yet. So that changed the calculation some, but we have done a bunch of work despite that to assess how specific it is and what else it does. And so far, we have not been able to find it in any other ant besides tawny crazy ants or any other insect arthropod. We've tested, several hundred colonies of maybe a dozen native ant species that are in contact with tawny crazy ants, infected tawny crazy ants, or environments where there were tawny crazy ants that should be full of spores. And we can't find the disease. So it appears to be quite specific, but there's a lot we don't understand.
Thanks. One more microsporidium question, and then we'll talk about kind of management. Do we know where this pathogen came from? Can you talk a little bit about the origin of microsporidium?
Yeah, that's the $60 million question. We have no idea. So we have looked, we're trying to do sort of an environmental assessment, trying to figure out if it's something native to some other arthropod in North America. The most common answer, the most common and most likely answer would be it came from South America, somehow with the ants. We have gone to South America and done work, and we've tested quite a few nests in South America, Tawny Crazy Ants, and we haven't been able to find it. So that's something we're working on actively and would really like to know the answer to.
Thank you. So the next questions are kind of about how do you get rid of them and how do you control? So one question was about, what kind of home remedies are a good idea? Can you talk about vinegar or just soap or other things that might, people are asking about in the chat? And related to that, folks would like to know how to report sightings in a way that would be useful.
Yeah, so so I guess starting with the remedies. There aren't a lot of great home remedies, but people should certainly try different things. But the most effective way to deal with them, frankly, is to deal with their nest sites. So if you're not going to be able to protect the whole landscape, but to protect your house or your well, the thing to do is to go out, 50 yards in every direction from it to the best of your ability. Maybe 50 yards is too far for what you can do. And eliminate nest sites. So piles of debris, piles of wood, trash, rotten logs, things like that. Deep mulch, really deep mulch is a problem too. And that's kind of the most effective cultural control. The other thing that you can do is in the early spring, not early spring, like April, go out and look for nests and destroy them. They go through an annual cycle of population cycle that I was talking about, and early spring is the bottleneck, right? That's where they coalesce into a certain limited number of nests, and the worker population has dwindled, and they're sort of at their most vulnerable. Those would be the sort of home cultural remedies I would recommend. What were some of the other parts of the question that you had?
Sure. And I just want to acknowledge, I'm seeing in some of these questions, people are giving specific examples of where they live or where they have seen infestations and how difficult that is for living there. And really, I see them wanting to do what they can to keep that population under control. So thanks for being here and for helping to share some of that. The other part of the question is where to report infestations.
Okay, yeah. So there, and I think that that Johanna and Audrey and Marissa can share this information probably in the chat or something, but the official place is Texas A&M University, the Department of Urban Entomology, and I can provide the exact contact information. I'm happy to receive samples from local stuff just to see what new populations are around the area, particularly if you're near the BCP.
Great. So the starting point for that is, the Texas A&M resources, and so we'll put that in the chat and in a follow-up emailed to everyone as well.
Great.
Great. Then there was another question specifically about RVs.
Okay.
And how to, if you realize that your recreational vehicle or your vehicle, it has an infestation, what should you do?
I generally don't like to advocate for pesticides, but if you have an RV and you're planning on moving it and it's full of ants, that's an important problem. And there are a couple of one thing that you can do is you could put baits inside the RV, and things with boric acid as a toxicant work reasonably well, and you want to put it in a sugar water solution, about 20% sugar water and boric acid. And the other would be to use a contact insecticide, at least on the parts of the RV that maybe you aren't interacting with a lot, inside cupboards or in the frame and stuff. Anything that has fipronil would be an option. I honestly don't know. Yeah, that might not. That's a tricky one, because if you're putting insecticides on the outside of an RV and it rains and that goes in the water, and if you're parked next to an aquatic system, then that insecticide is going into that aquatic system. I might try baits first, and then sort of go from there.
Thank you. And everyone probably saw, but Johanna has posted in the chat that AgriLife brochure about Tawny Crazy Ants that has more information and links. So check out the chat there, as well as a Texas Parks and Wildlife video about crazy ants. Our next question was about how to recognize nests. You mentioned a good times of year to look for nests, destroy those. How do you recognize a nest, and then what should you do if you find one?
Yeah, so recognizing a nest is usually they're either going to be under rocks or in rotten logs. So that's going to be the two major things to look for. And you're just out turning rocks and turning logs and looking to see if there are ants. And at that point, I mean, I'm going to assume that you are in an environment invaded by Tawny Crazy Ants already, and you know what they look like. And you've sort of gotten yourself a search image for what size they are and what color they are, because obviously there are going to be other ants in rotting logs and under rocks. But if you sort of tuned your eye enough that you feel like you can differentiate Tawny Crazy Ants from the other ants in your yard, then that's the way to look. And then to destroy them, you can use boiling water, works very well. You can also, if it's under a rock. Another is to take, if it's a log, you can actually sort of chop the log up and put it into a bucket or buckets or containers, and then you freeze those, or put them out in the sunshine for long enough, and they'll you put them in a black garbage bag, stick them in the sunshine, just leave them closed up for a long time. Or pesticides. I mean, you just sort of have to make your own judgment call as to what your comfort level is.
Thanks. That's a really helpful range of options, I think. The next question is, have you ever seen Tawny Crazy Ants exhaust their food sources?
Yeah. So we do see that these populations, if there aren't, at the center over time, this is many years, abundance come down. So that may be a sign of an exhaustion of food resources, or it may be a loss of nest sites that's independent of infection with this disease. They don't disappear, but they come down in abundance. And we don't really know exactly what the mechanism for that is, so I'm not sure.
Thanks. Our next question is about, do you know of any insects that predate Tawny Crazy Ants? This person saw something that was spider-like that went into an ant nest and looked like it killed and ate this ant. Can you talk about?
Yeah, so there are there are a lot of generalized ant predators that will go after tawny crazy ants, and spiders are a big one. Particularly jumping spiders are big ant predators. And then also wall spiders are another big ant predator group of spiders. So yeah, really any generalized ant predator is ant lions, things like this are definitely feeding on tawny crazy ants in environments where they've invaded. Sometimes in systems, no one's checked with tawny crazy ants at this point, but sometimes it turns out that invasive ant isn't quite a very great food resource, and so that there are effects on the predator populations just because they're feeding on low quality food, potato chips. But nobody's really looked with tawny crazy ants.
Thanks. So the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve is charged with protecting 62 caves, and it's charged with protecting that habitat because there are unique species there that sometimes are endemic only to caves in Central Texas. Can you talk a little bit about tawny crazy ant impact on caves and how tawny crazy ants use caves?
Yeah, sure. So I actually did a project on that a while back, and they definitely impact karst invertebrates, cave invertebrates. Caves are very cold places for ants. They're not very great habitat. So they aren't in caves all the time. So when conditions on the surface are pretty favorable for them, they're pretty much absent from caves. But in the high summer, like now, when the temperatures get up to, start pushing up into the triple digits and the humidities start falling, then the caves are actually better habitat than the surface, and the ants flow into the caves because of this distributed network of nests that they have. They can be very opportunistic in their use of space, and so they move into the caves in very large numbers. They do the same thing in winter time when it's very cold and cold snaps, because then the cave is relatively warm. But to a lesser degree, because usually in winter they've found other spaces in the ground already. We don't have data, them specifically on endangered invertebrates, but we did look at a cave with other karst invertebrates, and we did see some negative impacts on karst invertebrates through direct predation by tawny crazy ants. Yeah, did I miss any part of that question?
No, great, thank you. We have time for just a couple more questions, so I'll share these with you. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of tawny crazy ants on people? So on electrical systems, houses, etc.
Yeah, I have talked to a lot of folks who live with these things, and when these populations are very dense, they are incredibly annoying. I mean, they're more than annoying. People who apply pesticides, perimeter pesticides around their house, end up with these huge drifts of dead ants around their house, inches deep and inches wide. If they have a well and they're living off that well, that's a very problematic situation for them, because the well houses often has great environments for the ants to be, and the contact points of the pump get clogged with ants and short out. So people are always having to replace their contacts on their well and deal with the fact that their water's out. And then electrical boxes in general, which are full of wires and kind of tightly packed, create a space with the right sort of size holes for what they like. And so they move in, and then they short out the electrical system. So yeah, that can cause a lot of problems for industry, a lot of pumping, especially pumping industry that relies on pumping. A lot of pumping stations in Houston and things that were knocked out in the initial stages of the invasion before they really realized how intensively they had to treat these facilities in order to keep the ants down. And of course, treating the facilities with those intensities leads to the indirect effects of pesticides in the environment. So it's kind of it's not really a win-win. It's a no-win situation in that regard.
Yeah, yeah. Our last couple questions have to do with, oh, I see just one more popped in. We'll ask this one first. Does diatomaceous earth work to deter tawny crazy ants?
I have heard people say it does. I have not tried it personally. I think it's probably pretty effective until you get a rain. So and then just like any, if you're in a very dense population, any barrier like that, they will eventually overwhelm it. So it's the kind of thing where you'll have to continually refresh it if you're using it as a barrier treatment.
Great. So our last questions are kind of about your experience. Is this a population that you ever expected to study, or kind of can you tell us a little bit about the trajectory of your work? And then our very last question is, which do you prefer, tawny crazy ants or red imported fire ants? Someone wanted to know.
I'll take the last question first. I prefer fire ants. There's just a lot more diversity left, and that's my bias. I really like diversity. But there's a lot more diversity left when they're in fire ant invaded habitats than there are in tawny crazy ant environments. But you know, these tawny crazy ants appear to be like a little more short-lived populations. There seems to be some hope there. In terms of my trajectory, I got a degree in ecology, and I was very interested in ants, and I started studying invasive ants. I started out working in Argentina, looking at the interaction between fire ants and Argentine ants in Argentina, which is where they're both native. I was talking about that region of South America where all of these heavy-hitting invaders are from. And then I came here to work on imported fire ants and their biological control with forward flight parasitoids, because actually that's what I did my research on for my PhD, was in not that, but forward flies parasitoids that attack ants in the genus Phytoles, a native system in Arizona. And I worked on that for many years, and then I saw some of these tawny crazy ant populations, and I just saw how amazingly abundant and how amazingly impactful they were, and just decided that, you know, I needed to work on this.
Thank you. Well, we really appreciate your time spent today talking to us. And just a reminder for everybody who's watching that if you have questions about tawny crazy ants or want to report, use those links in the chat. And if you have tawny crazy ants where you live and you'd like to send in a sample, we could help to coordinate that. Great. Anything else I'm missing?
I think that's it. Just thank you so much, Dr. LeBrun. I really appreciate you taking time out to tell us all about this.
Thank you guys for the invitation. Always glad for a reason to do outreach. Appreciate it.
Great.
Awesome.
Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.
Bye.